This is the Open University. Our programme this evening is part of the Arts Foundation course, and is the first of two programmes which aim to introduce students to philosophy.
Hello again. When I have an album coming out, I like to talk about or think about what is an album. I read album reviews. I wonder why I make albums. Is there some virtue in putting a collection of songs together to record what you were thinking and feeling that year? And I think there is. But as a child, I didn't really cotton on to albums. I was born in 1960, so the 60s begin to become meaningful to me culturally from about, well, specifically 1967. And actually, there's a bunch of songs which you're listening to, or which I was listening to, like strange little, almost nursery rhyme-like songs like Zabadak, Carrie Ann, Ijuku Park, The Mighty Quinn, by a band who later covered one of my songs, actually, as Manfred Mann. Flowers in the Rain, I Can See for Miles. These were things, or Pink Floyd's See Emily Play, the things I'd hear on my little Crown transistor radio in the Doon Gardens in Edinburgh, cupping that to my ear. But this was the first LP that actually meant something to me, and it wasn't even bought, it was borrowed from a family friend called Aileen Marr, who was a bit of a swinger with kinky boots. Lived on Murray Place, around the corner from us. We lived on Ainsley Place at the time. And we kids had our own floor. We had like a ground floor flat with two basements below it. And the way that Edinburgh is geographically, it's the terrain is weird. So street level at the front, but at the back it was garden level. So the second basement led into a garden, which in turn led into the Doon Gardens, which is this sort of private, railed off pleasure garden beside the Water of Leith, the river. And it was a very idyllic place to spend one's childhood and to listen to pop records on a turntable down in the basement. We had our own piano down there. So I've started writing songs down there inspired by The Who, The Move and all these sort of mod groups. But this album, Revolver by the Beatles, became very important at that time and became the first album for me. Initially I hated the Beatles. I remember hearing She Loves You being sung or being played and thinking it was vulgar because of the word yeah. They said the word yeah instead of the word yes. I hated the way they abbreviated yes to yeah. But by the time Revolver came out, that psychedelic, trippy kind of cod philosophical, I'm tempted to call it, worldview became important and became a liberating kind of idea for me. And especially, I used to trampoline on the mattress of the bed that I slept on down there to the sound of Tomorrow Never Knows. I'm also thinking in this little list about album covers. And this is Klaus Voormann, who designed Revolver. I think it's a very elegant cover to this day. It looks great. It's still one of the best covers. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. It is not dying. It is not dying. We had a constant stream of lodgers staying in this large 3-level house that we lived in, a flat. To pay the bills, we had to let students and people stay. So their record collections influenced me a lot. And I have to say, before Revolver, the big artist for me was Françoise Hardy, who is still with us, is still alive. And we had a Hong Kong lodger called Ollie Kwan, who was studying law, I think, at Edinburgh University. And he had all the Vogue label 45s of Françoise Hardy. So at the same time I was listening to Revolver, I was also listening to all of the friends that I happened to meet who've been telling me all about love. Oh, how I wish it would happen to me. It's the only thing I'm thinking of. Want to find me a boy, just a nice looking boy, who will show me the way, who will teach me to say I love you. The absolute crystalline clarity and purity of those songs. So yeah, it wasn't always albums, but this became the first album. So 1967, there was just really this album. 1969, we moved to Athens, and the two albums that became important to me there, I think we only had like 4 albums in the house, and one of them was a spoken word comedy record with David Frost. But Abbey Road by the Beatles, which I think was the first record which I had been gifted for my birthday or something, or for Christmas. Maybe it was Christmas 1969, I got that as a present. We were very poor that year. We didn't have a Christmas tree, we just had a chair. So under the chair was this Abbey Road by the Beatles, which had just come out. And that was really important. It has a design by John Kosh, and Ian McMillan, of course, took the famous photograph of the band members crossing the zebra crossing. And it's a weird medley. It's Paul McCartney coming to terms with the Beach Boys, essentially. So they're trying to sing a lot about the sun, and not quite surfing, but almost, in as far as British artists can. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she changes from day to day. I wanna tell her that I love her a lot, but I gotta get a belly full of wine. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, one day I'm gonna make her mine. Oh yeah, someday I'm gonna make her mine. Hair is the other one in 1969 and 1970, that period when I was going to school at the British Embassy School in Athens. And I suppose Hair is like it's the first example of parody. I mean, the Beatles were also very parodic, an English group kind of parodying various types, as I've just said, the Beach Boys, various types of American music, Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers. Sodomy, fellatio, Cornelicus, pederasty. Father, why do these words sound so nasty? Masturbation can be fun. Join the holy orgy, Kama Sutra, everyone. Ride a White Swan by T-Rex was the first album I bought with my own money. We left Athens. I was already back at boarding school. So yeah, it's late 71, I think we left Athens, and my dad became the director of an English language study centre in Colchester. So we moved to Essex. We had a house in the country, large house called Willow House in Dedham, near Colchester. So going into town was quite an important thing. You came in from this rural setting to the centre of Colchester. For some reason, I really loved T-Rex, and bought this compilation which was just released. It was old Tyrannosaurus Rex material released by a Music for Pleasure label to cash in on Mark Bolan's success, pop mainstream success with T-Rex. So, but I loved the cover, which is kind of a knockoff graphic design by someone called Bernard Allen, who's an in-house designer for MFP, and his other work, it's very 70s, all the sort of colour gradations within the lettering and the big drop shadows. But I think it's a great cover. I have a lot of affection still for this cover. I'm talking not just about the music, but also about the graphic design of these things, because that was the point of this format. The artwork is so wonderfully large and square, and it was really a great pleasure to immerse yourself in the kind of thisness, the thisness of this. In a way you can't with thumbnails, obviously, and even shrunken down CD covers, and even single covers are pushing it. They lose their interest somewhat, unless they're hand-coloured Joseph K. rarities, in which case they're quite interesting. Catch a bright star and place it on your forehead, say a few spells and baby there you go. Take a black cat and place it on your shoulder, in the morning you'll know all you know. I didn't actually buy Electric Warrior. By this time I was back at boarding school in Edinburgh, which was horrible, disgusting experience. And there was a senior common room. So just about 6, out of 40 or 50 of us, there was only about 6 allowed access to this little room at the top of the boarding house with a record player in it. So this was where I learned about David Bowie from a guy called Mark Hughes. His sister lent him the first 4 RCA David Bowie releases, so they repackaged Space Oddity, as it became known, The Man Who Sold the World, as it became known, Hunky Dory, and the Ziggy album. And I was allowed up in the senior common room to listen to these. When I wasn't kicked out, because I got kicked out eventually of the senior common room for skipping tea to listen to Drive-In Saturday on my transistor radio when it was released. You weren't allowed to have a transistor radio, and you weren't allowed to skip tea, skip meals. It's very me, isn't it? Preferring music to food. So I was exiled from that paradise of having access to a record player for a while, but then allowed back in. And the other record, actually, which was again borrowed, was Lou Reed's Transformers. So we were listening to, and also at the same time, in the backdrop, there was the school endorsing the musicals of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. So you have things like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and Jesus Christ Superstar, which tie in with Ziggy, who is a messianic figure in himself. Godspell, all these biblical rock operas were happening at the time. And I always think that Ziggy Stardust, it's a Brechtian title, so it refers to the rise and fall of the city of Mahagoni by Brecht, but it also refers to Jesus Christ Superstar, because it's Ziggy, Antichrist Superstar, if you like. Something which Marilyn Manson picked up on later. So glam rock was kind of the thing, and this weird kind of gay subculture we had going in the boarding school. I had some sort of affair with a Chinese boy at the time. Very innocent affair with a Chinese boy. But for me, it was still just T-Rex and a bit of Lou Reed, and definitely David Bowie is the main man, as it were. 1972, Ziggy. And Ziggy, I got my grandparents to buy me a copy of Ziggy, so this was a great leap forward that I could actually have my own albums. I already had just the Beatles album, the T-Rex album, and now Ziggy was the 3rd LP which I actually owned. Only one of them I paid for, though, notably. My pocket money didn't stretch to actually buying records at the time. I did buy a cassette of Deep Purple and rock from some kid at school and just hated it, and it was a really murky pirate recording, and I didn't see the appeal at all of that sort of music. So glam rock was definitely floating my boat. Heavy metal and the other things, even folk music, whatever, were not. Although I was in the school orchestra and the school choir, so there must have been some influence, and I loved any kind of spoken word. So like the Sitwell's Facade, for instance, I loved that when I heard it. And I remember one of the disgraced teachers, to his credit, because now there's this ongoing kind of scandal associated with my school about sexual shenanigans of the masters and things like that. But one of the now disgraced and now dead masters made a musical setting, because he played the French horn, of Proof Rock by T.S. Eliot, which I loved as well. It was just a lunchtime performance in the school. Any kind of mixture of lyrics and music. Pop, it didn't have to be pop music at all. It could be classical music. It could be Walton doing the music for Facade of the Sitwells. I loved that. That was so evocative to me, kind of radiophonic meldings of word and music. So, but going back to the rock music, Ziggy Stardust has this cover, Brian Ward, Terry Pastor and George Underwood. George Underwood did hand colouring on black and white photos by Brian Ward, I think, and Terry Pastor did the layout on that album. And what's always struck me as weird about that is that Bowie, as Ziggy on that cover, doesn't look at all like the Ziggy we know later, the long mullet, the red spiky mullet and all the rest of it. He's got blonde, short hair. So they hadn't really fine-tuned. Weirdly enough, you then get compilations on the Decca label of early Bowie, the 60s Bowie, when he's doing sort of weird vaudeville narrative songs, looking like Ziggy. So there's a weird sense that Ziggy was in the 60s, and then in the 70s he's this kind of guy with blonde hair. Thanks to the hand colouring of George Underwood. 1973, Aladdin Sane, that becomes a very important release. Bowie at this point suddenly explodes, and he's got all his albums are in the charts at the same time. Aladdin Sane, the cover of that was passed around the boarding school, and I remember matron asking to see it and being absolutely appalled by the kind of very gay graphics on the inside of it. And I particularly, I love the music too. I love things like Lady Grinning Soul, the title track Aladdin Sane itself with its insane piano from Mike Garson. But also the artwork was super important, and I would never detach those values of music and the artwork. I think when you make an album, you're making music, and then you're finding, in my case, the way I do it is I find a visual corollary or commission a graphic designer to find a visual corollary for that music. So it's really important. Pin-ups. The music on Pin-ups has never really touched me. Even the cover of Emily Played, it's not as good as the original. Contractually, I believe he was... Tony DeFries was trying to get him out of his publishing deals, so he didn't want him to make any new music for a year or so. So after the success of Ziggy, it was just a cash-in, really. And what's interesting on that is just the photograph, the suit, the saxophone, the cover, essentially, with Twiggy. That's more interesting than the music itself, and fair enough, nothing wrong with that. 1974, by this time we've moved to Montreal, and I would go to the Fairview shopping centre, and there's a copy of Diamond Dogs. This is the thing, when you follow an artist, it's so international. You can see their albums. There are these record shops by the mid-70s, they're all over the world that we knew anyway, the Western developed world. Every country, you would have these major label presences like RCA selling the same albums. So you could have a very discontinuous life, a very fragmented life in various geographic locations, and yet follow the same artists. That would give you some kind of continuity. We had this radical, because my dad was a TEFL teacher, a radical discontinuity of place, but I could keep a kind of thread of... I would always know the feeling of each year according to what David Bowie was doing in that year, in the 70s anyway. That became the barometer of, it wasn't so much where you were, but what was Bowie doing, wearing, singing about? Who was he being that year? Was he singing black? Was he being white? He was making these references which were specific to the given year. And also, I can still to this day tell by Bowie's hairstyle in any given photograph which year it is, whether it's 1977 or 79, whether it's 1983. His hair becomes a barometer in and of itself. So 1974, Diamond Dogs pops up on the racks at, I think it's Eaton's department store in Fairview Shopping Centre. We're living in a suburb outside Montreal, and we have to come in the car. This is the awful fate of suburban kids growing up in the 70s. It's still the age of the carbon dinosaur, and you had to go in your dad's car if you wanted to buy anything. Or downtown on the train, I would go to art classes at Sir George Williams University in central Montreal to do art classes. So I could take the commuter train occasionally. I missed the beginning of the Diamond Dogs tour because my parents thought it would be decadent and dangerous. 1975, Young Americans, I associate with... I first saw it on a truck stop on the freeway between Montreal and Boston. We were going down to Boston, I think, to see a football match that my brother was in. Was that it? Something like that. Anyway, we stopped and I saw Young Americans I think I saw a cassette of it on a rack and realised Bowie had a new record out. I didn't buy it then. We went back to Edinburgh in 1975 and I bought it finally in Edinburgh from Bruce's record shop on Rose Street. And I remember being really disappointed with the sound of it. I wasn't ready for this transition to soul music, which happened during that tour. They dumped the amazing stage set, the Orwellian stage set, or the expressionist film, sort of G.W. Pabst or Fritz Lang kind of set of Hunger City. Ditched it halfway through. It was super expensive to build and also to destroy. Tony DeFries was furious that they had spent all this money, several $1 million on this set, and then it was trashed halfway through the tour and stripped down to a soul review. And Bowie kind of transitioned racially to a soul singer. He had a black girlfriend at the time, Eva Cherry. But it took me a while. I taped, because Bruce had this returns policy, so you could take a record back if you didn't like it and trade it for another one. So I taped Young Americans and got my own copy for the first time with The Man Who Sold the World in exchange for it. So I was still an early 70s Bowie fan at that point. I didn't really, at the time, appreciate where he was going. Later on, I came to love the Young Americans album, although I think he ruined it by leaving off the original tracks. He did this John Lennon collaboration, which, you know, works well with Fame, but then Across the Universe, I think, was a mistake. And I would have preferred the It's Gotta Be Me, whatever, all these other tracks which have now since come to light, and which I think are better and would have made a better album. But I love tracks like Win. And you can hear some influence in Momus from that period of Bowie, belatedly, because it took me a while to come back round to it. That year, 1975, I do start diversifying, so I'm also listening to Autobahn and Radioactivity, and the visuals again for Kraftwerk are super important. Very kind of knowing winks at motorway signs or 1930s radios, but later, of course, things like the Man Machine really bringing the artwork to the fore with their sort of takes on the Bauhaus, constructivism, supremacism, and all the rest of it. So this was a way to edge into knowledge of a graphic design knowledge of 20th century avant-garde culture and European avant-garde culture as well, because rock music was mostly in the 70s. It seemed to be a mediated version of American culture, which we Europeans were allowed to copy, sometimes badly, sometimes well. Especially countries like Germany, you see an awful lot of awful Anglo-Saxon copies. There's Schlager on the one hand, which is the local music, but then there's this sort of Roger Whittaker and these Western artists, super bland mainstream ones, usually. Also, other people's records still influencing me. My mother got really into Paul Simon, so we had records like Still Crazy After All These Years in the house, and that was an influence on my songwriting. I guess there's some great songs on that. 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, My Little Town. So she was also into Brian Ferry, so weirdly enough, I know more from the 70s of Brian Ferry's solo career than I do about Roxy Music. My mother didn't buy any Roxy Music records. She wasn't quite that cool, but she did like his retro kind of crooner stuff like These Foolish Things on the solo album of the same title. So, and by this time we were going back in Scotland to kind of Comet Warehouse or Economy Warehouse. There were these big out-of-town warehouses where you'd go, your dad would drive you to some place where the records were super cheap. Everything was something 99, like $1.99 for an album or something, which is cheaper than the central city record shops. And so you'd get armfuls of albums there for the Family Music Centre, it's called by this point. I could listen to my own records on headphones in the Family Music Centre, but I rarely could play them out loud. Sometimes we'd be all playing Scrabble in the family and I'd put on a Kraftwerk record and I'd be really proud of how alien it sounded in amongst the kind of music that they would be playing, which would be stuff like Evita, the rock opera, or Peter Skeller and, this kind of stuff. Or my brother would be listening to Peter Frampton. Ironically enough, the album of 1976 was I'm in You by Peter Frampton. No, Frampton Comes Alive, actually, which sold, 15 million copies or something. It sold more than Let's Dance sold, although he was touring later in the 80s with Bowie. Frampton, of course, was the son of the art master at Bowie's school, and they became friends in the 50s. And but Frampton outsold Bowie. My brother was also into things like Status Quo. It'd be embarrassing him here if you're watching, Mark. So much less cool things, and he was at a different school with kind of the landed gentry, a school called Loretto out in Musselburgh. I was at the Edinburgh Academy, a sort of urban school, I guess you could call it. But I was definitely more attuned to cool music, what I thought of as cool music at the time. But in 1976, I remember buying Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, for instance, at Comet Warehouse. That also became a big influence, actual black music rather than David Bowie doing his Plastic Soul Approximations, which was black music for white people in a sort of unkind description. And Station to Station comes out in 76 as well. I'm always kind of wavering in my loyalty to Bowie at this point. He's a very variable artist, even in the 70s, which is his golden, his imperial phase. He was capable of throwaway stuff like the Pin-Ups album, or stuff that took a left turn that you didn't want to follow, or a right turn that you didn't want to follow. I wasn't sure about Station to Station, although I did end up singing along to it at the top of my voice in the family living room in Drummond Place where we lived. Walking around, and I'd walk around in circles like this, singing, Lord, I kneel and offer you my world on the wing. But I really got back into Bowie in a big way from 77 onwards. So actually from seeing the Heroes cover on Rayburn Place, a record shop in Rayburn Place called, I don't know, Reckless Records or something, I can't remember what it was called. But this image was so startling. He looked so different from any other record sleeve. Is that Bowie? What's he doing in this strange robotic pose, and the typography is really cool, and the photography is really cool. So again, it was the visual aspect, and this, of course, it's a Tsukita photograph taken in Japan, I think, in Kyoto. I think so. But with this kind of silent age, silent film typography and grainy backdrop, and so again, another killer sleeve, which brought me back. And I actually bought Heroes before Low, but I bought them. They both came out in 77. Bought them both in 77, but in a different order, and that really reconfirmed my correctness in having been a Bowie fan. 77 was also the year of Trans-Europe Express, Ha 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 by Ultravox. So I started getting into new wave records which had been influenced by Bowie and by Roxy Music. So bands like Ultravox. Talking Heads 77 was being heavily endorsed by Bowie and Eno. I also got records as presents for other people, records I wanted to listen to myself but was a bit embarrassed to. So I bought my brother for birthday or Christmas Elvis Costello's first album, My Aim Is True, and sneakily listened to it. I wasn't sure about Elvis Costello. I didn't really like the Americanism and the retro kind of Romeo was restless, he was ready to kill. That kind of side to him was a bit, what the hell is he doing? Even Talking Heads, I thought they were a bit plain. There was some weird plainness in their guitar playing which I didn't really respond to. It wasn't exciting like Kraftwerk was, on a sonic level. But I was starting to respond to what's now called New Wave. Anyway, that's the history of me and LPs. I hope you enjoyed it.
Open University.
This is BBC Two. Now, Bob Harris introduces this week's edition of
Philosophy.